Hi, my name is Cole Watson. I'm with the Watson Law Firm. We get this question a lot about stepchildren and property. Usually it's a situation where maybe a husband has died and now the spouse has, of course, survived him, but there's children that the husband had, stepchildren for the widow. So we just want to create this resource just so you know generally what happens in Texas. So when you have real property, a house that you and your husband or your spouse owned at one point in time, and then your spouse has died, and that spouse had children, that those children have a what's called a vested interest in the property. And so the question also comes up of, okay, so you had a husband and wife, and I'm not going to draw a graphic here, but let's just say the spouse has survived. His stepchildren might be asking questions, or they might have their hand out, or they might not be in the picture at all. But in Texas, at least, there is a vested interest in the property. So here's just a little chart that's a breakdown to show if you are a married person. I'm going to switch over to yellow real quick. If you're a married person with children outside of the current marriage, and of course your death is recent, after September 1, 1993, then that community property interest, and this is where the husband and wife own the property together. They'd both be on the deed, or if you bought the property after you were married, this would be considered community property. So that community property interest, half would go to the surviving spouse, and the other half would go to the deceased spouse's kids. So in other words, they would become co-owners of that property with the surviving spouse. This is not always an ideal scenario, as you can imagine, and you might be experiencing for yourself. If you're co-owning a piece of property with your stepchildren, maybe the stepchildren are great and you all get along with each other, which is fantastic. That's a fairly simple process. Maybe they're out of the picture and you haven't heard from them in a number of years. It might be decades since you've heard from them. They still have an interest in the property without, and this is the key, any other kind of estate plan. So if I can just go back real quick. If your spouse, let's just say, had some sort of will, perhaps had some sort of estate plan, maybe had what's called a ladybird deed. Let's spell that out real quick. A ladybird deed. And I have another video on this as well. Then that could very well dictate what happens to the property interest. What we're dealing with here, though, is if the husband or the spouse, the deceased spouse, didn't have any kind of will and didn't have any kind of estate plan, there's no documents in place, then they die and their property passes through what's called intestate succession. That's Chapter 201 of the Texas Estates Code. So that's the property interest we have to resolve. Of course, if it's what's called separate property, which would be if the spouse owned the property prior to the marriage or perhaps inherited the property during the marriage, then how that separate property passes when that spouse dies, again, without any kind of estate plan, is then subject to the surviving spouse's what's called life estate. So the surviving spouse has the right to live there for as long as he or she lives. But then ultimately the kids are going to get 100% of that separate property interest. Okay, so what we will generally do in the situation when there is, let's just say, a husband and wife, and let's say the husband had kids from a previous marriage, so the husband dies and the husband has kids, then we will look at what's called his heirship. And all that means is we got to figure out who his heirs at law are. If he was married, then it could be his spouse, so it'd be the wife, and then those kids as well. The affidavit of heirship will show that, so it'll effectually show how the property interest vested, whether it's this way or this way. And then once we have that documented, we have people that'll sign off on that as affiants. They'll sign the affidavit. That's usually the surviving spouse and then two disinterested witnesses. Then depending on how well the family gets along, then we'll usually have the stepchildren sign what's called an heirship deed. The heirship deed just allows the stepchildren to convey their property interest to the surviving spouse. Sometimes money's involved. It's just property for cash. Sometimes the stepchildren are perfectly fine with conveying their interest over. They understand that that's your property, or it's the right thing to do, or any number of things. For whatever reason, we're in a situation where the stepchildren are not getting along with you as the surviving spouse, then our options become somewhat limited. We might have to go through what's called probate. We might have to go through a partition lawsuit. We might have to go through some other avenues as well. It just frankly depends. So if you are in a situation where your family's not getting along, whether that's because of pre-existing relationship, hurt feelings, then our options are there, but they are fairly involved and fairly intense. If your stepchildren are perfectly fine with conveying your property interest over and your spouse did not have a will, then we can have what's called affidavits of heirship and heirship's deed put together. So a number of ways to resolve that property interest. Suffice it to say, though, if the spouse did not have a will or any kind of estate plan in place and had children from outside the marriage or from a previous relationship, then those children do have a vested interest in the real property, in the home, and so something will need to be done about that title. Thank you. If you got any questions, let us know. If this was helpful, like it, subscribe, whatever you do with YouTube or wherever we're at here. We just generally want to help out everyday Texans, and that's where our firm exists. If you need to get in contact with us, there'll be a link or something here or there, wherever I can point to. You'll find us. Get in contact with us. Let us know if we can help. Thanks.